money. Too much hair. I bet you there's more down there.
I mean, not that I'm intentionally trying to disappoint you, but...
Let the girl go, or I'll shoot you in the dick.
Why you gotta shoot me in the dick?
I do not want to shoot you in the dick.
Then don't!
I will try very hard to not shoot you in the dick. But to be perfectly honest, I'm most likely going to shoot you in the dick.
What about Directive 42?
Really?
Yeah, RoboCop. Directive 42! Directive 42!
What is Directive 42?
Oh, well, it states that RoboCop must answer any unanswered questions about the RoboCop series before taking any action.
Who would program that? That seems like super impractical.
Okay, let's do this. Your move. Creep.
Question number 1.
What year does RoboCop take place?
I mean, you'd think that this would be an easy one for me, being the timeline guy and all, but the answer is more confusing than you would think. It's obvious that they were going for a nebulous, in the near future kind of time frame, even though everyone's method of dress and their haircuts and such seemed to place them in the late 80s when the film was shot. The technology matches that as well, as do the cars, so you'd think that it couldn't be that far into the future. Back in 2009, one of the screenwriters, the great Ed Neumeyer, gave an interview and stated that the setting of the film was actually a point of contention before filming because people kept asking what year it was set in, and his response was always, "I'm not gonna tell you." And it seems like that has carried over now that the film is out and he's not really elaborated any further. There's really not much to clue us in on the film itself, but we have several hints as to the length of time that it takes place over. Clearly, some time passes during the movie, since we see Murphy join the force, get killed, and then the whole process of building Robo, and then his deals on the street, leading up to the finale. And it's not like that takes place in a short time frame, like a week or two. But we do know that it happens over the course of 4 months, which we can gain from the film itself. In the beginning, we see an OCP meeting that says the construction of Delta City will begin in 6 months.
In 6 months, we begin construction.
And this scene is intercut into the middle of Alex Murphy's first day on the job, so that's the start of the events. Much later on, right before the big finale scene, Dick Jones is having a conversation with supercriminal Red Foreman, and he says that Delta's construction is now starting in 2 months.
But Delta City begins construction in 2 months.
Considering that when the Ed 209 demonstration goes wrong, Bob Morton tells the old man that he's confident they can have a RoboCop prototype ready in 90 days, that all lines up. We see them celebrating New Year's Eve during the building, so those 90 days take place over a December to January jump. So, if that all takes 90 days, then the events of the film from when Robo is introduced to the ending take place over 1 month. So, the film spans 4 months that span 2 calendar years. What those years may be, though, are pretty unconfirmed. There was an arcade game, and the introduction claimed that it takes place in the year 1990, a mere 3 years after the film's release, but that seems highly unlikely. There's a possible answer in a novelization of the movie written by Ed Naha, which gives a likely answer by discussing Sylvester Stallone and saying that he was 97 years old. Since Sly was born in 1946, that would make it 2043, which is a possibility for the setting then. And they bring it up to discuss the fact that he's making Rambo 38, Old Blood, and considering that we're only around 20 years from 2043, that means if he wants that to happen, Stallone's gonna have to put out like 33 more entries between now and then. So we're gonna get more than one Rambo movie a year, which I'm sure is something we're all chomping at the bit for, right? But after all that, I guess MGM just straight up decided to be like, this is when it takes place. And in a trailer for the streaming version, which debuted a couple of years ago, they flat out say that Murphy was killed in October of 2029 and came online as Robo in 2030, which means that it runs from around October of 29 to February of 30. And I guess I could have just led this whole answer off with that, and it would have been over a lot quicker. But the real joy is in the journey, right? Question number 2.
How much of Murphy's body is left in Robo?
Now, the journey of Alex Murphy is a pretty rough one. How this man survived the amount of punishment that he receives is well beyond me. To recap, he had his entire hand blown off and is then shot at minimum 20 times, including several shotgun blasts from a close range. Now, he is wearing body armor, which certainly absorbed some of the brunt of a portion of those shots, but they were like 2 feet away from him, so not that much. Finally, Boddicker shoots him directly in the head, and when he's wheeled into the hospital, the guy is still kicking. I mean, barely though. It's then that they decide to utilize what's left of him to enact the RoboCop program, and after that aforementioned 90 days or so, he's reborn into this super metal body. But the question is, exactly how much of him remains? Now, a portion of this is addressed in the scene in which they are putting him together, and Bob Morton instructs the tech to lose the arm. It seems that they were able to save a portion of it, and he potentially could have had some of his actual arm on the body, but Bob says that they had agreed on total body prosthesis. So we know that in terms of actual physical body parts, nothing really remains. His arms, his legs, all of that is gone. So what does that leave? RoboCop 2 gives us somewhat of a hint here, since when they're sizing up Kane to use as RoboCop 2, we see what they put into the body, and it's his brain, eyes, and portions of his spinal column. The film also has Robo saying that he has pain sensors, and that's an interesting concept because it could very likely be that there's like a sort of program that simulates the concept of pain, like a command key or something, which would be a weird thing to include. But it could also be actual pain, and his central nervous system could be hooked up to it, allowing him to actually feel those sensations. Again, I'm not really sure why they would want their robot enforcer to feel pain, because it seems like that would likely be a detriment to what they want it for, but okay. We can also assume that they kept portions of his face, but we'll get into that in the next question. But there's also a part in part 3 in which Dr. Lazarus says that portions of his brain were used, which seems to indicate that Murphy's entire intact brain may not have made the port over. Now, that could very easily be down to the fact that a portion of his brain would have been missing, mostly due to a bullet tearing out a chunk of it. Sadly, considering that it doesn't seem like he's able to crack a number of puns or gags, it would appear as if they were completely unable to transplant his funny bone.
What do you want from me? I am a dad.
Question number 3.
What happens if you shoot him in the face?
So let's put ourselves in the shoes of some of the criminals in RoboCop. You're a drug dealer, working at your drug place, under the watchful eyes of your drug boss, and the door gets smashed in, and in comes RoboCop, just sort of shooting everyone he drug sees. Now, you look at this guy, and he's all armored up. And of course, everyone shoots at him, and you can see that he's completely bulletproof. So it's pointless, but no one really just looks at him and says, oh hey, this guy's entire lower face is exposed, I'm gonna shoot him there. Like, it seems like the easy thing to do, right? But would that even work? Would it kill him or even hurt him? First off, let's address his face, since there's some contradictory elements in the film as to whether or not it's his actual skin, made from his own flesh or a simulated mock-up. We see his face for the first time around the ending of the first film, and it's kind of weird because he has this whole helmet and chin guard thing and some sort of black lining on his neck here, and then he drills out the screws from either side, and then he just lifts the top of the helmet off, which somehow also like erases the chin piece and the neck thing, and they're very clearly not attached when he lifts this sucker off. But that's not really important. I guess he sneakily pulled them off in this portion that you can't totally see or whatever. Fine, but right here, you can clearly see a bullet mark on his forehead, in the place where Clarence shot him. It seems really unlikely that this would be something that they would reproduce if they were to do a fake face, simply modeled on his real one. But the other side of it comes up in part 2, when Murphy comes face to face with his wife. She touches his skin and comments that it's cold, suggesting that it's not warm skin, and he states that they've made this to honor him, insinuating that it's a plastic face created in Murphy's image as opposed to the real thing. But it's not living flesh, so it would be unlikely to be warm anyway, so that actually does make sense, and he's trying to allow his wife the chance to forget him and move on. So him saying it's a reproduction tracks. It is his real face, but he tells her it's not, so she doesn't cling to that hope any further. The final nail comes in part 3 when Dr. Lazarus flat out states that it is his real face and not a simulated one. But that does raise the other question of how exactly that flesh does not rot, which is something to kind of just go with. But it's possible that his systems feeding into it are supplying the flesh with oxygen and the nutrients that they need to survive, which again seems like a long way to go to just have living skin on his face when a simple fake one would have sufficed. But regardless, it is flesh, so the question of whether shooting him there would damage him is relevant. And I think based on what we see from the unmasking scene, it appears to just be flesh, draped around a metal frame. The skin is pulled tight around this metal casing, which is likely made from the same bulletproof material that the rest of him is. So shooting him in the face would elicit the same ting sound effect and a ricocheted shot that it would anywhere else. However, since it is living flesh, a bullet wound there would damage it, and likely would cause part of it to be removed, although it would merely be a cosmetic wound and not actually damage the robot. Since he's pretty happy with how he looks in the scene where the police are firing on him, he is protecting his face area, holding on to all that's left of his former appearance. But it's not necessary to his survival. So you can shoot him right in the mouth, but it won't do anything. And holy crap, I could take that last line in so many directions, but I'm pretty sure that YouTube would not be happy with me if I did. Question number 4.
Was there 208 previous Eds?
I don't think that this is a question that people are really stewing over, but it's certainly one that crossed my mind. In the movie, OCP has also developed the Ed 209 droid, but during a product demonstration gone wrong, it straight up murders one of the board members. I'm not totally sure why they would use live ammunition for a simple product demo, but then again, this demonstration was set up by a group of corporate guys, and when is the last time that you saw upper management make a decision that benefited anyone, really? And besides, the movie takes place in America, so I don't know why anyone expects anything less. But anyway, after that happens, the Ed 209 program is shelved in favor of Bob Morton's Robocop dealio, and Eddie Boy is set aside for special occasions that don't involve stairs. But the minor question here is, how long have they been working on Ed? And have they run through a number of different versions that were all numbered Ed 1 through Ed 208? We never see any hints of any other models in the movies themselves, but we get some sorts of hints from other media. There is a minor indicator in RoboCop 2 when they're going through the different versions of RoboCop only to watch them all kill themselves. Each of these versions are called RoboCop 2 instead of giving them each their own individual number designation. So it would appear that they don't just cycle through numbers based upon failed models. That would kind of indicate that they only went with a number designation when the product was put into use. But based on people's reactions to it, it doesn't appear as if there's been any previous versions of the Ed at play anywhere. The people at that meeting are treating a big robot enforcer like a new concept to them. So I think that those two aspects combined together tell us that this is likely the first presentation of the technology, although it's unlikely that there was 208 previous runs of it, and the 209 was simply an assigned code, possibly in reference to its software versions. Now, there were other versions of it in some other media. In the remake, there actually is a previous version called the ED 208, so the insinuation there is that in that universe, there were models that ran through the number sets. But there it appears as if this sort of drone tech had been in effect for years, so that makes sense in that one. There was also an animated series that did introduce an updated version of the bot, but it was called the ED 260, and again, I find it unlikely that there were 51 versions in between the two, so I think that the number is more about the software or just a random designation than anything else. A later comic book series released by Dynamite Press introduced a giant version, although this was ED 309, so there were versions with additional numbers, just not before 209. It makes sense that he was something new anyway, since he cried like a little baby.
Bitches leave.
Question number 5.
What is that TV show that's always on?
One of Paul Verhoeven's trademarks with his films is the universe building and sort of creating these alternate worlds, and RoboCop is no difference. Not only did it serve as a simple tale of a robot cop, but it was a pretty complex social commentary, and it's not subtle, like at all. In fact, I call RoboCop Exhibit 78 in my ongoing series called Movies Have Always Had Social and Political Messages, but You Were Just Too Young to Notice Them. The clippings we see of the television programs and the news updates here are definitely a touch of satire in terms of how this world works, and the news stuff is a precursor of sorts to what Verhoeven does in Starship Troopers. But the most prominent thing on the TVs here is the show that everyone seems to be watching at all times, and it's the I'd buy that for $1 guy.
I'd buy that for $1.
It looks like it's just some raunchy sitcom, much like Married with Children, but amplified quite a bit with the inclusion of more scantily clad models and such. In every moment of the show we see, the seeming star of the show utters his catchphrase. And sure, it seems like a little throwaway bit, just some body program that these people enjoy, but this is a Verhoeven movie, so you can bet that it's not only intentional, but it has a distinct purpose. I don't think that it will come as a huge shock to most that RoboCop is a commentary on unfettered capitalism and the dangers of allowing massive corporations political influence lest they steer us into a more fascist society where the police force cracks down on the poor but literally can't come after the wealthy. It's also shown that OCP owns the TV networks and the news, allowing them to control favorable reporting, and their goal is dumbing down the general population here by giving them lowbrow shows with repeatable catchphrases that they absolutely do repeat.
I'd buy that for $1.
The show was never given a name in the movie proper, but the script actually gives more details about it. It's called Not My Problem, and the star is named Bixby Snyder. And a deleted moment from the script further reveals that he was arrested for offering roles to underage female stars in exchange for sex. Not only that, but the co-writers of the original film, Neumeier and Michael Miner, submitted a script for the sequel that was ultimately rejected that featured a subplot in which Bixby would be elected as president. So it's clear that they had a broader message for the character. So yeah, it's clearly a gag in the movie, but it plays into this bigger world and the director's message about the nature of television programs and an indication of the type of thing that the ruling class in the film is using to push their citizens further into complacency. And that's likely more depth than you expected from a movie about a guy who's part machine, part man, and all cop. Question number 6.
What's the deal with Dick Jones's arms?
So at the very ending of the film, the main villain, Dick Jones, is confronted by RoboCop. Murphy had just wiped out Clarence Boddick's gang and was there to arrest the double-crossing corporate greaseball, but is unable because of that pesky Directive 4. He can't act against Jones because he's part of OCP, and Directive 4 prevents him from either harming or arresting any member of the executive board. However, the old man fires Dick, which frees Robo to act. And can we just talk about that for a second? Like, how intuitive was Robo's software that it worked instantly like that? Like, normally you'd think that a senior executive like that might have some sort of contract arrangement, or at the very least HR would have to be involved. Did no paperwork need to be processed? Is it really just saying the words "you're fired" out loud or what legally makes him a part of the company? Like, if he had said that in jest, would it count as he was fired? I don't know. But I guess whatever it is, Robo was able to act immediately, and he shoots Dick. He shoots Dick Jones since he did that other thing a little earlier in the film. But Mr. Jones gets a couple of bullets in him and falls backwards through a window, falling to his death, because an 80s movie wasn't over until the villain fell from a great height. But when he does fall, his arms suddenly stretch out to about 6 feet long, looking impossibly gangly as he plummets. So, what happened here? Why were his arms so freaking elongated? Did they confuse him for Ralph Dibny or something? Well, I asked my friend Tom, who is kind of the official expert on all things RoboCop, and he told me that in real life, Ronnie Cox, the actor who plays Dick Jones, has extremely long arms. So long that he can touch his toes without bending down. The special effects guys made his arms to scale, and his falling was the very first thing that they shot. However, Cox then chose to take on an affectation, like some actors do, a role with an accent, and he wanted to play the part as a short-armed man, and had the costume designer create him special garments to hide his extended appendages. But by this point, the effect shot was in the can, and by the time that they realized that the arm lengths would not match up, they didn't have enough money to fix it. Okay, so maybe that's not totally true, but believe it or not, that's not really far from the reality of it. Now, clearly, they used a puppet for the scene, and the model was in the correct proportions. It did not have long arms or anything. But when they went to shoot the sequence, they had to do it in the effects studio, which featured limited room to move. When it came down to it, they couldn't raise the camera up high enough to get the desired effect. In order to get what they wanted, they had to use a wider angle lens, which distorted the image like a fisheye lens would. In order to counteract this, they would have either had to reshoot the scene in a larger studio space or rebuild a new puppet with short arms to allow for the distorted view. Most likely they either didn't have time or the available funds to reshoot this and fix it, so they just rolled with the long arm look. Question number 7.
What happened to Frank Miller's RoboCop 2?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the original screenwriters of the first film were hired to write the sequel, and they worked up a draft with the subtitle of The Corporate Wars. It actually jumped ahead 25 years and was a much different and much bigger film. But after Neumeier and Miner participated in the writer's strike and the 5-month-long time gap meant that they were in breach of contract, the pair were fired. After this, they went out to a man who the previous scribes had recommended, comics writer Frank Miller. They also suggested Alan Moore, but that dude passed, mostly because Moore's noted hatred of the film medium is widely known. But at this point, Miller was well established in the comics world for the Dark Knight comic, and Orion Pictures thought his style would translate well to Robo. The writer agreed and began work immediately, turning in a massive draft that was considered unfilmable by the studio due to their limitations. He then pumped out 4 more drafts trying to refine the concept to be more suited to what could be done within the budget. His version involves some similar beats to what would finally be released, but has a far more satirical slant and focuses more on OCP as the clear villain of the story. The aspect of them trying to push residents out of old Detroit through the use of rehab soldiers, a corporate mercenary group hired to replace the police officers who were still on strike. But the biggest difference is the complete absence of Kane and his drug-running group. Instead, the main villain of the piece would be split. At first, a psychotic member of the rehab force named Kong would be placed into the RoboCop 2 shell, and he would be the hulking villain. However, the main baddie would be Dr. Margaret Love, a character that is essentially replaced by Dr. Fax in the original movie. But in this version, she's over the top and just as batty as Kong is. After Robo leaves her for dead, she then erases Kong and uploads herself into the Robo form, becoming the new RoboCop 2 and having the climactic face-off with Murphy. Another big change is the death of Sergeant Reed, but there's quite a bit of that remains that's similar as well. Since Orion was pretty happy with this one, thinking it was still too much, and they brought on Waylon Green, who had just written a version of Robinson Crusoe, but more importantly, Solar Babies, to revise Miller's draft. It was this draft that streamlined things and brought in Kane and his crew to act as the main antagonists and shift some of the satire away from the corporate world, while also adding quite a bit of comedy in there. Miller's version would remain on a shelf until the mid-2000s when Avatar Press would team up with Stephen Grant to adapt the screenplay to a comic series. There, the original concepts for the film and storyline can be read for the first time, and it's, I guess I'm not a huge Frank Miller fan, and I'm also not a huge fan of RoboCop 2, but this script doesn't really fix the problems with it, and the satire elements are perhaps they're just too on the nose. Sure, Verhoeven's dig weren't too subtle either, but this feels handed out with an extra helping of edgelord, so it's not really the same. Question number 8.
What happened to the old man in RoboCop 3?
In RoboCop 3, widely considered to be the absolute best film of the franchise, there's a notable omission. The old man, played by Conal Cochran himself, Dan O'Herlihy, and he did not make an appearance in this film, and is instead replaced by Rip Torn as a new character. Now, in real life, his non-inclusion makes perfect sense, since O'Herlihy declined to return. It seems that almost everyone connected with the previous films was a strong no thank you. Peter Weller had been hesitant about even returning for the second film, so when it came time to do the third, he outright passed, since he was busy filming Naked Lunch anyway and had a very easy out. Of course, this led to the role being recast, and here's a fun fact. They were planning on recasting him for the second film, since Weller hated shooting in the suit, and they figured he wasn't likely going to come back, and they figured that it didn't truly matter who was in the outfit anyhow, since you didn't see their face too much, and they just acted like a robot. Turned out, they were wrong, since the Dust Devil just didn't quite live up to the standards that Weller had set. But then there was O'Herlihy. He didn't have the convenient out of saying, oh hey, I can't because, Cronenberg is letting me poke a mugwump. He had to read the script. But after he did, he said, what is this movie? Some kind of joke on the children? And he passed. Nancy Allen was one of the only major players to say yes, and that was just because she absolutely hated Part 2 and had a miserable, horrible experience making the film, and wanted her character to have a better send-off than that. But yeah, the old man didn't return, so his absence had to be addressed in the film. But then again, it really isn't. There's literally just one line of dialogue in which Johnson, one of the few actors to appear in all 3 films and live through them, says, "Remember the old man, Jeff. Everyone's expendable." So, it's clear that he no longer worked with OCP, and sometime in the interim between parts 2 and 3, he either retired or died. And I think based upon the expendable comment, it sounds like the company forced him out. To recap really quick, in the first film, the old man seems like a decent guy, or at least not as outright evil as Dick Jones or Clarence. But in part 2, he makes a full shift into a cackling, evil corporate guy. It's his plans that go wrong in Robo 2, and innocent people are killed. Although in the end, he's able to shift blame to Doc Fax. Although it's possible to think that someone saw through all this and it was eventually realized that he was at fault and forced him out, hence the expendable comment, yeah, high up corporate rich guy facing accountability. now we know it's a movie. But instead, we have an actual concrete answer, one that came up recently. In 2023, there was a RoboCop video game release, which featured the return of Peter Weller as the characters, and was said to take place in the gaps between parts 2 and 3. In that one, as the old fella is dying from being an old fella, he creates something called Project Afterlife, which would store his being. When he finally kicks it from a heart attack, he's placed in the RoboCop 2 shell and goes on a rampage, eventually being defeated by Murphy. This then leads into the events of the third film, again, widely considered by pretty much everyone to be the absolute best film in the franchise. Question number 9.
In the remake, why, oh why, did they keep RoboCop's hand?
The RoboCop remake certainly wasn't beloved, or even be-liked. Honestly, it was barely benoticed. But there was one thing that everyone paid attention to, and that was his damn hand. The look of this particular Robo is a little more streamlined. And as is standard with everything modernized in order to look cooler, they had to make it basic black, as if there was something not cool about steel gray. I mean, I get that it's better than the weird crystal blue color from the sequel, but this makes the whole look completely generic. At least when the new design is introduced, it sports the classic color scheme, and this one seems to have gone a similar route to the original in that it's a near-complete body prosthesis. In fact, there's a moment where they pull away the robotic components to reveal what is left of this Murphy, and it's mostly just his head parts and spinal stuff again. No arms and legs, but there's that hand. The only other part of his body that appears to be organic at all is his right hand, which is simple flesh and blood. Now, this is never explained in the film, but there's reasons that can be implied, and there's also an official reason given in a deleted scene, although it's kind of dumb. In that cut bit, they're discussing the various parts of Murphy that have survived his explosion, because instead of being shot to pieces here, this version of the character is just blown up in a car. Beetlejuice, who is the CEO of Omnicorp, this universe's version of OCP, states that his father always said that you can tell a lot about a man by his handshake. And so they leave it on.
Hey, can you save his right hand? My father always said you can tell a lot about a man by his handshake.
So that this RoboCop can shake hands, even though it leaves him with an obvious and blatant weak fleshy spot to target. Like seriously, if you're a criminal, just shoot his hand off, his very human hand, and you've instantly rendered him about 50% less effective. But that plays into a little of what I think, and when I went to research this one, I found out that my take on this is pretty widely the prevailing theory anyway, so I don't feel like I'm presenting some sort of off-the-cuff, pulled-out-of-my-ass answer here. But there is a prevailing theme in this film about the use of drones. The main gist of it is that the general public has a distrust of their use on American soil, and there's something called the Dreyfus Act that forbids their use here. Therefore, if Omnicorp plans to use any sort of drone technology, they have to be secretive about it. There's an entire subplot that's sadly not explored very thoroughly where Murphy is actually not in control of his own actions, but is programmed to think he is. Like he's a drone, but there's plausible deniability that he's not. The human face and form are there to convince everyone that he actually isn't a full-on robot and that it's a person doing all this. So, the hand is kind of integral to that. There's a robot cop out there shooting people. The public wants to know that it's a human being and that the decision to fire their gun is made with human emotion and control. Because everyone knows that human police officers always put a lot of thought and care into this decision, especially since more than 600 people a year are shot and killed by police officers. And yeah, I can see why they cut this. Question number 10.
Is RoboCop connected to Skynet?
So it's the 80s, and you're a movie about a robot. So of course, people have to talk about you in relation to the other mega 80s movie about a robot, and yeah, is RoboCop connected to the Terminator? Well, according to Frank Miller, they were. Back in 1992, between the release of RoboCop 2 and 3, and just after Terminator 2 had been released, Dark Horse Comics picked up the rights to both franchises. Since they had already been successful with pitting the Aliens versus the Predators, they decided that merging these two IPs would be equally as fruitful. So they hired Miller, who by this point had already seen his work on the sequel gutted, and he ran with the concept. Famed Thor artist Walt Simonson was brought aboard for the art, and they told a tale that wove the two universes together. In this series, it's stated that Skynet only becomes self-aware after uplinking with Robo, which is what gives it the idea to create Terminators to wipe out humanity. A soldier from the future comes back to try to prevent all this, but there's several instances of time travel in which things are altered, and then re-altered for things to go the robot's way. As the story progresses, the Terminators eventually overpower Murphy and forcefully jack him into the system, awakening Skynet and ensuring Judgment Day. Now, it's pretty clear that this is not in the continuity of the original Terminator universe. The time frame between the first film and the placement of Judgment Day in regards to when RoboCop appears to be set seem like two distinct realities. There's meant to just be a handful of years between the events of Terminator 2 and when the nukes dropped, and that seems like too short of a window for the weird futuristic dystopia of when RoboCop is set. So, even though this does tie the two together, it's still firmly entrenched in the RoboCop continuity. As the story goes on, the robots take over and wipe out the human race, and Murphy is scrapped. But elements of him still exist in Skynet, and he spends a few decades trying to find a flaw in the system to exploit, which he eventually does, and builds himself a new RoboCop Terminator form, and then eventually converts an entire armada and turns the tide of the battle. After defeating Skynet, he then goes back in time to destroy Skynet before it exists, which causes him to fade from existence since the timeline he came from has now been erased. The series was popular enough for them to talk about adapting it into a film form, although nothing ever became of that. But a video game was made depicting the two metal guys duking it out, and there was a follow-up comic series much later on from Dynamite called Kill Human. But it wasn't as impactful as this one. So, yeah, the two universes are linked in a way, although clearly not on screen.
Is that it?
How many times does RoboCop say I'll be back?
Dude, that's not even RoboCop.
Do you have any further questions?
No.
So there you have it. That dude just got shot in the dick.
Madam, you have suffered an emotional shock and exhibited extraordinary patience to stand there while I recited all of those answers. I will now notify you to hit the like button and to subscribe as well, pressing the bell icon in order to get further notifications. Additional assistance can be found at patreon.com/movietimelines, where support can be given. Not for you, for the channel, but for now, I must go somewhere. A crime is being committed, and I have several more bullets for dicks.